Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going through some tips and tricks for the early game in Star Wars Legion. So yeah, essentially just going to go through some things that I've been thinking about recently and perhaps over a bit of a longer period actually about how to kind of manage the early game in Star Wars Legion. I think especially now the game is down to 5 turns, so much of it is dependent on how you manage the early game, how you then set yourself up for what's going to come in the next few turns. So I'm going to start off by going through some quite general sort of tips and tricks, which I've maybe touched on before, and then going to get into some more specific stuff, kind of go through scenario by scenario, looking at kind of how you can manage the range, especially in the early game, when you can be attacked, when you won't be able to be attacked, and then how you can sort of push up to those objectives later on in the game. So to start off with some general advice, how to turn one. What are some key things to think about? The first one is the later you can go, the better. Due to the nature of the way deployment works in Star Wars Legion, you want to be the last one on the board if you can. You want to be bringing your most powerful stuff on latest, so it has the widest range of targets and the sort of smallest chance of it being shot in return. This goes for units like Vader, who might not be looking to attack turn one, but will definitely be looking to position themselves for the follow-up turn. So if you're planning to be hyper aggressive with Vader, for instance, waiting as late as you can to infiltrate and then going into the dive can be really powerful as a way to sort of manage that early game. Same goes with, land speeders, AATs, all these sort of big vehicles. Like being able to go a little bit after your opponent can be huge in those kind of swing turns for having those powerful units around later in the game. My general advice as well is standing orders and advanced intel are your friends. There is a reason advanced intel is the only sort of green that has a positive win rate on Longshanks. Is huge to get that pass in your stack and be able to sort of again delay coming down that bit earlier. And it's always going to be useful. It's always good to come on later, because even if you're not planning to shoot turn one, your opponent probably is, and it also gives you more opportunity to kind of react to what your opponent is doing. Same with standing orders or any 4-pip. So this could be Poggle's 4-pip or Ahsoka's 4-pip as well, for instance. Like those are just going to be so powerful for having the best shot at going last. And while standing orders looks pretty unremarkable, basically, especially if your opponent plays any other pip, it's kind of got you a free pass, is the way to think about it. Like it means you're just going that bit later, and especially also if you can force a roll off and things like that. Like those sort of roll offs can be really swingy, which I don't know if is necessarily a bad thing. Like I think there are enough valid options for those turn one command cards that maybe it doesn't always come down to that roll off, but there are enough times when it is sort of standing orders against standing orders where it doesn't feel great. A tip I gave in my sort of previous version of this Legion guide, where I was talking about kind of general ideas, is it's better to have a unit alive and too far away than too close and dead. And I think this is definitely something I've been thinking about recently. I used to run a lot of kind of Ahsoka and Sabine, and with the Mandos there, I always had like all these dodges, all this stuff ready to go, and I was like, oh, let's make use of it. Let's go forward. Let's be more aggressive. But unless you are really committing your whole force to really pushing up and trying to buy yourself more space in return for taking some of those early game shots, it's just not worth it. And if you lose a key piece on turn one, that then ripple effect that I sometimes talk about, like that goes through the entire game, can be absolutely huge. It hurts your command cards, it hurts your ability to kind of control the space, and that can actually end up losing your game in some situations. So even if it sometimes feels bad to not push up as much as you sometimes can, it's better to have that piece available for the late game than to throw it away early and then just not have that power ready to go in the late game. Most of the game, I would say, is decided on turn one. Like there are often times against sort of more experienced and really strong players where I can kind of look at the board and I'm like, actually, this is probably over already. Like there might just be some situations where maybe they've out deployed you, or they found a little trick, or they've been able to delay something that bit longer that's just pushed you into a really bad spot. And I would say, if I had to put a percentage on it, I'd say 40 to 45% of the game is probably decided on turn one, and then probably another like 25 or 30% is decided on turn two, and then actually after that, turn 3, 4, 5, unless there are really big swings, it probably isn't that important. So turn one is absolutely huge. So if you're gonna take a moment to pause and to really think, it's better to take that early so that you can still have more tools available to you to kind of impact the game, than to just kind of blitz through turn one and then really realize you put yourself in a bad spot. So taking that moment to pause and really thinking about like how are you actually going to go through and win this game, especially when later on I'm going to talk about like movement distances and range distances and things like that, can be really important. As I've kind of hinted at, if you're going to push up, just commit to it. Like it's a really difficult balance, and I'm always really wary of saying like sit back and be a bit more passive, because then you're not going to win the game. But it's a cliche and it's a cop out, but you have to find the balance. And essentially, if you are going to commit to be aggressive or to sort of sitting back, make sure you're being consistent with all your units doing the same thing. Don't just throw 2 units up into a more aggressive spot, especially if they're vehicles, because then they're really going to struggle to get cover. And you just paint big targets on them. Like, I think a really common mistake people make with aquas is going actually fairly early in the turn, infiltrating them, moving forward, and maybe taking a sort of a range 3 shot and maybe units in heavy cover. Yes, that's, it's not bad. You might hit for 4 or 5, 3 or 4 maybe after cover, and then you do a little bit of damage. But then you've painted a huge target on what's going to be one of your key units throughout the game. And if they've still got land speeders, AAT, snail, like whatever, if they've still got all that stuff ready to go, you've just painted a huge target on that unit, and they're not going to survive the turn, because most armies will have access, unless they're really stacking the activations, to be able to blow them off the board turn 1. And then you've lost what should be a really annoying and kind of sticky unit in the late game. But that turn 1 is when they are most vulnerable, so you really need to hold them back and try and think about which units you actually need to be alive going into the late game. Final thing is understanding of this order. So what's going to go early, what don't I care about, what do I really need to try and hold late if I can, and then if you do need stuff to go late, how are you going to get orders on it, how are you going to control when it comes out, whether that's improvised orders, HQ uplink, seize initiative, trusted agent, whatever. Like, if there are key pieces that you really need to control, how are you actually going to control them? Because yes, you might get lucky with the order stack in a couple of games, but over sort of a more extended period, eventually you're going to get screwed over by RNG, and then you're going to be in a really tough spot. Moving on to command cards turn 1. Very simple, essentially. Standing order should be a default unless there is a really compelling reason to play something else. And there are sometimes compelling reasons to play something else. So I mentioned like Ahsoka and Poggle's 4 pips. I think they might give more order control. Can't remember what they say off the top of my head. I think Ahsoka's 4 pip orders 2 units, so that might be a little advantage, getting a little bit of order control. But yeah, standing orders is great. The exceptions are if you need to set up buff cards, if you need to set up cards that are going to help you gain board control, or if you're going to set up things you really need that order control on. Examples of this, as I'm showing here, is Leia's permanent card, A Beautiful Friendship. And, there are other permanent cards, so some of IG's IG-11, I think it is, who gets the permanent command cards. Like, it's tricky because they're lower pips, and I've actually really shifted away from Leia Wicket, because in order to set up the combo, which I really enjoy, you have to play a 2 pip, which means you're almost always going first. Like, it's so rare, apart from, I guess, if people are playing the Air Support Republic 2 pip, it's so rare for people to play anything below a 3 pip on turn 1. And in that case, you've played a 2 pip, you're probably going to be going first. And then that means if you're running, land speeders or even Mando resistance that you're maybe hoping to jump forward and have a decent shot with, they're just not going to get that opportunity, or there'll be extra barriers to them doing that. So as much as I love this card, if it was a 4 pip, it would be phenomenal, but because it's a 2 pip, it just doesn't quite make the cut for me, unfortunately. Darkness Descends. Infiltrating Vader is incredibly powerful. So you need to decide whether that payoff for that extra board control and that extra threat that Vader gives you is worth not playing standing orders over. And that's board dependent, and that's quite scenario dependent. I'm personally a huge infiltrate believer in Vader. I think I've spoken about this before. Think of this command card as just giving you an extra turn of Vader. Also think of it as pushing all of your opponent's units back, unless they're willing to take that hit. It's pushing all of them back, basically the range of your deployment, because that's where you can infiltrate to. If you think of it like that, this command card is huge. And yes, Reliable 2 is great, but I still think Infiltrate's probably worth it most of the time. And finally, you've got Luminous Beings of We, which not only has great token setup, but also just perfect order control, which is really nice. Used to have Palpatine's an entire Legion as well, which was a really nice command card if you read that order control. So yeah, again, if you're desperate for order control and you're really going to struggle to get it otherwise, then something like this 3 pip is absolutely fine. But yeah, default should be standing orders or a 4 pip. and then look for exceptions if you need them. Final bit here is just going to be thinking about the order that your list itself wants to come down in. So I've got two lists here that I think I actually borrowed. I think one might actually be pre Sleeper Cell nerf. I can't remember off the top of my head, but anyway. And then the other one is from the Legion Cantina Cup, which result is coming soon. I just need to get around to making that video. But I'm just going to look at these sort of one by one and talk about which order I'd hope for the units to come down. I think it's probably fairly obvious and kind of what I would do in each of these situations. So assuming you're playing standing orders on 1, I would then be doing my order from the card on the land speeder, which would then be onboard comms channeling probably to Luke. And then you would be taking your HQ uplink on your land speeder to get the order on that one. So then on turn 1, you have the orders on your 2 land speeders and Luke. And after that, the rest of the stuff, not super relevant. Ideally, you want your core to come out first, but it's not game breaking, and you're just going to have to accept that probably your ATRTs and your sleeper cell might not come down that efficiently, and they might just have to come down a bit earlier than they'd otherwise want them to. But yeah, essentially your fleets are filler, and then your sleeper cell and ATRTs going later if they can, but you have no order control, so you're not going to bother with them. But then your 2 big units, your land speeders and Luke, are able to come down later on and kind of have the impact you want them to have. Obviously, Luke, probably not that impactful in the early game unless your opponent's done something really weird, but he will be able to position himself quite well and maybe around the opponent's threats that he wants to go and target. Looking over at this list on the right hand side, there's obviously quite a sort of range of threats going on here. You've got your filler and your kind of 4B1s and your droidicas and arguably the Sith probe as well. Maul's probably going to be infiltrating as per his command card, so you want him to go as late as you can. And then Grievous, ideally a bit later, but it doesn't matter that much because realistically turn 1 he's probably just moving behind LOS blocking anyway, so if he needs to go early, he goes early. That's absolutely fine. The big ones are going to be probably your BXs and your AATs because they're the 2 that have the most realistic chance of attacking turn 1. Obviously, you're hoping the AAT is always getting its attack off. That big base and that long threat range is great. But don't sleep with BXs either. Scout 3, couple of speed 2s. They got charged with the vibro swords. Like, they could actually catch people off guard. You know, if you're on like a breakthrough, for instance, or a close the pocket, that could really catch people out. So yeah, I think essentially your core's mostly filler on turn 1, along with the Deckers and the Sith probe droids. Then you're just basically hoping to keep Maul and your AAT as long as you can to go with those BXs as well. So both of these, like, you have quite a clear sort of distinction of what needs to go late on turn 1 and what actually you don't mind having sort of filler with. And that could be really nice. It's what I also talk about sometimes with having like multiple units in the same sort of, if you have multiple special forces that do different things, multiple ports that do different things, that can sometimes be quite beneficial just to buy you a bit of space. But yeah, now we're going to get sort of into the nitty gritty a bit more, and I thought first we'd talk about kind of movement and relative threat ranges. So what I've set up here is obviously this wouldn't actually happen in a game, but it's just useful as a kind of example. The red dot here is representing a unit that the front of its base is just touching the range 1 line on your side of the board if you're a blue player in close the pocket. And what I'm going to show is just how far each of the different sort of main unit types you might tend to see will be able to move in a typical turn. So starting off here, we have a typical infantry moving at speed 2. So speed 2 on an infantry base is slightly, and by slightly I mean like a millimeter over range 1 if you come off the end of the prong. So if you're doing 2 speed 2s in a perfect line towards the center, you'll be able to move from here to just inside that sort of middle line. So effectively range 2. So that's the way to think of an infantry. If you're pre-measuring, they can basically move range 2 if they do 2 speed 2s back to back. And that's not terrible, like that's decent. And if you position well, you sort of think ahead, then, you know, you can actually sort of manipulate that fairly well, especially if you're popping out from behind LOS blocking. It can actually be surprisingly far. But for instance here, in this position, you're not going to be able to challenge either of the 2 furthest objectives. You'd only be able to challenge that center one. And this can be really important for thinking about how you're going to set up for objectives. So I'll talk about later about especially recover the research, which is huge for kind of pre-measuring and setting up, because you need to be contesting all for every turn. It's just anticipating which units can have challenging when. So pre-measuring this kind of stuff can be really important. Moving up to a bigger base, so this would be if you had a larger base. So this is an ATST, for instance. So if you're doing 2 speed 2s with that larger base, you get, I think it's marginally over range 3. I think it almost is exactly range 3 actually, with 2 speed 2 moves with that larger base. And again here, the difference you can see is that you would be able to challenge all 3 objectives pretty comfortably. In fact, you'd be able to challenge the center objective with just 1 move, which can be really important, and you'd get actually fairly close to challenging the 2 side objectives with just 1 move, but you would need that second move to get into contesting range. And sometimes that difference between having to take that second move can be really important. So again, that's where pre-measuring when your action economy is so important. Like realistically, you're getting a max of 10 actions with each individual unit. So having to sort of waste 10% of a unit's actions just because you didn't quite measure accurate enough can be really important. So thinking about these movement distances can be really important. And the final one, just because I can, is speeders. So speeders can move, I think it's range 4.5 if you do 3 speed 3s. It's ridiculous. Like, I think I actually worked out a speeder can be touching, or I think actually probably inside the left-hand deployment here and still challenge the furthest right objective by doing 3 speed 3s. Like, you can be so far from an objective, and this is only on Close the Pocket, which has 3 central ones. Like on something like Recover, on something like Shifting, or especially on Intercept, where you need to get to that back objective, having something that can just go straight across the board. Like if you look here, if you imagine this is Intercept, a speeder could be comfortably inside your deployment and comfortably challenge the back objective by just going straight across the board with 3 speed 3s. And that's the advantage of having a unit like that that can just move so quickly across the board. No other units in the game can offer what a speeder offers. So while they don't have the best damage output, while they're not the toughest, if you just need a unit that can do that, that can offer that threat range, having 1 or maybe 2 speeders in your arsenal can be super valuable. Cool, so that's movement ranges. Now what I'm going to do is go objective by objective. I'm going to start by talking about kind of threat ranges on turn 1, and then going to look at sort of how you can then progress past turn 1, maybe moving into the late game. So we're going to start on Close the Pocket, which I was about to say is one of the more straightforward ones, but can actually end up being a little bit weird sometimes. You have your corner deployments, and first thing you're going to notice is how close together the corners of those deployments are. So it might be quite tempting to try and jump around that corner and go nice and close, which is why, if you're not planning to do that, the logical place to end up is being funneled towards the middle. So what you'll see here, and I'll look at this in more detail later, is you often see a kind of funnel towards that central one, especially because the central objective is the most valuable. So if we build up the threat ranges kind of gradually, so this is the first sort of threat range you're going to look at. Effectively what I've done for each of these is these are range 4 from the corners, so where you move onto the board of each of the deployments. Now, this obviously isn't a perfect measure. There are units that will be able to do this and shoot further and stuff like that, but this is imagining a core squad moving on at speed 2 and then shooting range 3, which is kind of fairly typical for what most units you'll be coming up against will offer in terms of threat range. Some will be able to offer a greater threat range, some will be more focused up close, but this is effectively range 4 from where your opponent will be moving on from. Now, the slight, obviously, technical issue here is that you can't move on like this for Close the Pocket because you need to move around the corner. So the actual threat range would be a little bit less than this, but I'm trying to be consistent. Each of them is just range 4 from where you would be moving on from. And what you can see is that range 4 from the closest corner to you of your opponent's deployment zone, so that's the red deployment zone, actually stretches really far into your area. And that's why they can feel really close and like why it might be tempting to try and jump onto your opponent. If we add the next set of deployment zones, so these are sort of from the inside corners, so those sort of furthest in corners, and again, that's the range 4 measure. You can see how far down those are reaching. And then the final thing I'm going to add is just range 4 from the remaining edges. So that's either from the back edge or from the corner. Those are the sort of range 4 distances from each of those. And so what you're left with is basically the area you could stand if you wanted to avoid being in your opponent's range 4. And you can see here why it's logical to be funneled towards the center, because if you want to try and avoid your opponent's main threats. So for instance, 2 of the big threats that are limited to range 4 early game would be Sleeper Cell and Arcs. They both have Scout 2. They can both then do a speed 2 move, so that gets them to range 4. and then they could do a range 2 shot. So if you wanted to stay outside of that range 4, you would need to follow this kind of pattern of gradually pushing towards the center. So again, this is fairly logical as to why you see people tend to funnel towards that center on that turn 1. With that in mind, what will tend to happen, and I've kind of laid out a very broad example of a board here, is basically you will tend to see, this is maybe an oversimplification, but there's 2 main ways it can go down. Either the temptation is to just stack one side and then leave a couple of token units kind of out there to keep pressure on your opponent. So you can see what I've done here. Imagine we're blue player in all of these, is I've put my main force, so Leia, Wicket, a couple of Rebel Troopers and Luke. There's obviously more units in the actual game, but I'm not going to add them because it gets confusing. And then I've put some token units which could be quite hard hitting and have good threat range. So behind some LOS blocking, gone for my sleeper cell, gone for my tawns. They can both threaten that side objective and maybe kind of punch up in terms of their damage output and then maybe threat on that objective. On my opponent's side, you can see I've kind of imagined they're doing the same thing. So the main thrust of their army is on the left-hand side, and then I've got a couple of token units, so a fast unit in that speeder bike to threaten that objective, and then ranged troopers who'll be able to consistently put fire down onto either the central objective or the objective on the right-hand side. The other option is you split kind of equally and you try and funnel in, but I think that can be a little bit tricky because if you separate your force and your opponent does go stronger on one side, they can then basically wipe out your force on one side and then push to the center. So then they're left controlling the center and one side pretty definitely, and you might really struggle to hold that right hand objective. So it is obviously very board dependent, very situation dependent as to what the best way to split it is, but this is what I often see happening in my games. 2 strong forces in the corners and then kind of token units left to maybe keep that frustration and force your opponent to leave a couple of units back on that right hand or left hand objective. Moving over to Breakthrough, and this one is just an absolute mess, and I know quite a few sort of competitive players who really hate playing this one just because the ranges are so weird, as we'll see in a second. Again, in all of these, imagining we are the blue player. So if we start by looking at the ranges, I basically marked this is range 4 from the 2 closest corners of the red player's deployment area. So you can see that top right corner and that bottom left corner. And you can see straight away that immediately they can threaten both of your objectives very easily with just range 4. And especially in that top right corner, you need to be really careful to not throw yourself too far forward. And if you do that, you really open yourself up to having, if you have tried to defend that one quite heavily, just giving your opponent free shots early game. And weirdly, for Breakthrough, even though there is so much potential for like early game scraps, sometimes it can just boil down to a bit of a stalemate as you both kind of sit a bit further back and neither quite commit to controlling the objective. And if we add on sort of the additional deployment areas, you can see there's again that temptation to sit sort of that bit closer, be that bit safer, rather than going up and being hyper aggressive. Because again, if you want to be safe, the logical place to be is kind of in this sort of vaguely central area, a bit like you would see on, I don't know, Recover the Research, for instance. But if you do fancy being a bit more aggressive and you are tooled up for it, that's when you can start to make those aggressive moves across. But if you do want to sit back and be safe, you actually have to sit surprisingly far back, just given how aggressive those deployment areas can be. But yeah, in terms of how I've found games of Breakthrough tend to play out, the easiest ones to attack, I would say, are your opponent's top right objective, just because you have 2 ways of accessing it. And I'm going to talk more, this comes more into like Recover the Research and shifting priorities than it does for this one. But if you imagine the sort of lines of fire and the way that you can attack or be attacked, if we were to try and defend our objectives, so this is imagining, we're having ranged attacks from our opponent's side. This bottom left objective can be attacked from 2 different directions. So you can be hit from this top left corner and you can be hit from the center or the sort of top right of your opponent's deployment. So that means if they have long range threats, and especially if they've parked like an AAT or a land speeder or something in the middle, you're then vulnerable from 2 sides. And that makes it that bit harder to find cover because you need basically a big vertical wall, and any kind of curvature or any angle on it is going to make it really hard to find cover. And while cover isn't a huge thing, like it's definitely not a deal breaker, if it's line of sight blocking, being able to manipulate line of sight blocking is huge. And if it's that bit harder to find line of sight blocking just because you can be hit from 2 different angles in this bottom left, it isn't then that bit easier to defend the objective in the top right, because unless your opponent really pushes aggressively into the top right, you're probably only going to be really attacked from one angle, this kind of diagonal coming from your opponent's deployment. So if you are looking to kind of just, feed one unit at a time, or, set up more centrally, it is maybe just that bit easier to hide behind line of sight blocking for that top objective than it is for that bottom left objective. And how do I kind of see most of my breakthrough games playing out? It's a real breakthrough is one of the more chaotic ones, and I actually really hope they do more kind of scenarios like this, just because it forces people to play in a way that I don't think they enjoy and maybe makes them a bit uncomfortable, which I really like. But in general, what you are trying to do is you're trying to hold on to one objective while pushing aggressively for the other objective, because if you can contest, you stop your opponent scoring VPs, and if you control, you get a whole bunch of extra VPs, so there's that incentive. But what I tend to do is sort of sit fairly defensively, kind of in the center of my deployment area, so I can cover both of them if I need to kind of wait and see what my opponent does. But if I had to default to something, it'd be putting my kind of token units towards the top right, so that they can just hide behind line of sight blocking, sit there as long as they need to, and then jump out when they want to attack. Whereas my units in the bottom left, yes, they'll be maybe a bit more exposed, but hopefully I've then got the defensive tech and the token sharing and stuff to be able to deal with that. So, for instance, like Sleeper Cell being shot is hopefully a much bigger deal than like Leia being shot, when she can get back up and should have dodges and things like that. So that's just how I would imagine it going. Again, hugely board scenario, whatever terrain dependent, but remember, it is just that bit easier if you need a unit that just wants to be hidden out of sight, ready to jump out and be that back marker unit to hide on that top right, than it is to hide on that bottom left objective. Moving on, and this is going to be a really long video, so I'm going to start speeding up a little bit. Looking at bunker assault, this is the same as intercept, so will be exactly the same map for both. It's actually fairly straightforward. You've got your range 4 from your corners, then you've got that range 4 in the center, and again you can see it's much easier to track because it's effectively a rectangle, apart from if you're pushing up really aggressively on the right hand side, but most of the time you're not going to be doing that. And bunker, I've critiqued a few times, I'll continue to critique it. I think bunker's quite boring. I think bunker is one of the ones that really enables you to kind of blob up and then just do whatever you want, and it tends to favor like armies that favor doing that. So for instance, if you've got EXD with some token sharing, a big clone ball, things like that, or even lay a wicket, sharing out those dodges, not a bad combo. Like those units with exemplar can get more value just because they're more likely to be sat at more units that will be at range 2. So there's kind of two ways to approach bunker assault, and both of them tend to revolve around controlling the center of the board for me. What will tend to happen is one person will be stronger in sort of one vertical line, so whether that's the left or the right, and then the other person will tend to be stronger in the other vertical line. So you'll tend to leave your sort of more passive units sat a bit further back. So for instance here you can see like an E-web or sleeper cell sat that bit further back, ready to jump out and shoot anything that pushes onto their objective. They're not the units that are planning to push up themselves, they're just the units that are hoping to attack and sort of catch those off guard for units that do try and push onto your objective. But basically, if you imagine these arrows, it's all about controlling the area sort of just inside the objective is the way I tend to think about it. Like it's a really tricky one to define and obviously very terrain dependent, but if you can control sort of the vague center and then a bit just across, it will buy you so much space and enable you to actually defend your own objective that bit more easily, because I think that's the sort of balance that needs to be struck with bunker assault. It's not just about being really aggressive and getting to your opponent's one, because then you just end up sort of like rotating around the center. If you can actually get control of the center and stop your opponent being able to push up, it actually enables you to kind of hamper their plans as well as pushing your own up. So I don't find bunker particularly interesting. It just seems to be kind of... I actually find close the pocket more interesting tactically than bunker. I think bunker just tends to boil down into who's got more firepower on turn 1, and then it turns into a bit of a brawl, and then it doesn't feel maybe as like nuanced and interesting as some of the other scenarios. Similar story with Intercept Signals. So again, looking at the deployments, you're just going to end up with this kind of rectangle in the center going up to that range 4. If you imagine, again, we're thinking about range 4 units here. Obviously, if your opponent has longer range units, they'll be able to shoot further, but I can't map up all the different ranges and stuff because that would not make a particularly interesting video. Intercept does at least have a little bit more going for it, because even though you're arguably still kind of trying to control the center of the board, it tends to be on the extremities. So it's actually kind of the right center and the left center rather than just trying to control the center of the board. And what this again can sometimes happen is you end up kind of rotating around the middle, but maybe happening that bit further away. And because of the nature of how you score Intercept, as long as you have tough units that can maybe dive onto an objective, you can maybe leave some of those a bit more isolated to kind of solo a section of your opponent's army. So, Bad Batch, Vader, Luke, whatever. If you have these big units that are really tough to kill, it can just tick up those VPs for you every turn. That can be really valuable. Also, having a unit that can kind of dive that back objective can be really useful. I think this does happen on Bunker as well, but maybe not to the same extent. Just because Intercept forces a bit more of an inherent split, like you're likely to maybe have more sort of strength. I'll show it here actually. Go ahead to what I was imagining. So here you can see I've imagined a scenario. Again, it'll play out differently with different scenarios, whatever. I've put the strength of my rebel list over here on the left hand side, and my opponent's put the strength of their rebel list here on the right, of the Empire list on the right hand side. And then you can see Vader is kind of floating, ready to go for this left objective, and Luke's kind of floating to go for this right objective. This is supposing that you have your tokens on your sort of big objective players. One of the difficulties with Intercept is because they have to be so close in order to score. Once Luke, Vader, whatever has dived onto that objective, they kind of have to stay there. And the only way they can leave is if they can get themselves in a position to either dive for the back objectives, that's the one in the center, or they can gain enough value by standing there. So here, if my opponent is going to dive onto this left objective with Vader, and they have the intercept, and I don't think I can kill Vader, I'd be like, okay, fine, we leave it, not going to let Vader get value, let's just go to the right-hand side and commit my force over there. And because Vader is slower and less able to react, and more importantly, worth a lot more points than maybe the stuff I might already have committed, that then it strengthens me on the right-hand side. And even though I won't be then scoring the VPs because Vader will be securing that one objective over there on the left-hand side, it does mean hopefully I'll have a better chance of defending my own objective in the center, pushing to my opponent's one in the center, and then also hopefully securing the one on the right-hand side. So it is really tricky to know how to balance your commitment on Intercept, which again, I'm talking so much more about it because I think it's so much more interesting than Bunker. Just because if I've got the Tauns here, my opponent's got that speeder bike, then that's something to consider, because if they can hold them till the end of the turn and then dive, they're going to score a VP. And then they force me next turn as well. So it's a VP plus some actions. And you really need to consider that. It might mean you're taking more standbys, sitting more passively. And then if your standbys don't trigger, you've wasted a turn with that unit. So I think Intercept does just have that maybe bit more interest to it, just because it can sort of, if you have a token on a fast unit or a strong unit, it forces you to play differently. The other thing you can do is if you just put it on chumps and just feed them onto the objective, one per turn, they just run in late after maybe your opponent's stuff has all gone, then actually you can score VPs with really cheap units. If a rebel trooper goes second or third last and they sprint onto an objective and they score, just because they've got their 2 dodges, they'd be in heavy cover, they're really difficult to deal with, then that's a 40-point unit that scored you 1 VP. You only need 12. Basically 80 points of your army roughly should be scoring a VP. So that rebel trooper's already done more than enough work. And the other part of Intercept that's really good is because when a unit dies, you don't care, just pick it up with another unit's contesting, go and do something else. I think Intercept's got loads of really interesting really interesting aspects to it in comparison to, say, Bunker Assault, despite the fact they have the same deployment. Recover the Research, as boring as the day is long, but it can actually offer some interesting aspects to it. And the reason why Recover is so interesting is because your entire job is to force your opponent to just not score all the VPs on 1 or 2 turns. If you can do that, you're probably going to win the game, because Recover is really, really easy to score on. So if you get yourself in a bad spot and you don't score max points each turn, you're probably going to lose. And it forces you to then really be aggressive and try and change the game. Because Recover is one of the, I'd say, the few objectives that actually quite commonly leads to a slightly early finish, say on turn 4, just because it's quite easy to score max every turn. And especially if you're scoring the secondary, you can just go 4, 4, 4, and then the game's over. So thinking about ranges on recover, it's fairly straightforward. So we've got our corners here again. You can see how far that range 4 reaches. Crucially, it does enable you to attack both of the back objectives within reason. Obviously, if you're just on the far side, then you might be out of range, but you would then be susceptible to an attack after that. And then if we add the extra range 4s on, so this is for sort of main deployment area and then leading into the corner, you can see that basically, look, again, there's this sort of safe area just in and around your deployment. If you push beyond that, you're going to put yourself at risk of that range 4 attack. And basically what you need to think about with recover is, how much am I going to oversimplify? I'll oversimplify a lot. There are only 2 objectives that really matter for recover the research, because these top 2, the ones I marked with the green arrows, are your opponent's home objectives, and these bottom right ones, the 2 red ones, are your home objectives. And if you lose either of these, i.e. you can't contest either of these, the game's over anyway and you've lost, like you're in such a bad position that it's unwinnable. These should be scored every single turn. And you have to be in such a catastrophically bad position, or like so insanely aggressive, to not score these ones, that, as I say, if you've lost them, it's game over, it's fine, make your peace with it. So the only ones left really are the 2 kind of ones in contested territory. So that's the one sort of near your deployment zone on the left and near your opponent's deployment zone on the right. And it might seem like this one in the bottom left is the one that should be treated as your home objective because it's closest. But thinking again about how you can be attacked and where you can be attacked from, it's actually a bit easier in some ways to go about attacking the top right objective than it is to go about holding the bottom left objective. Because to hold that bottom left objective, you need to have a unit that can get to this bottom left objective while having the possibility to be attacked from 2 separate angles. Because realistically, your opponent will have a unit in the top left because there's an objective here. So I don't know, Cody, Arfs, like whatever. If something, you can see, I'm playing a bit of Gar at the moment, have something sitting here and just shooting at this objective, and that makes it really difficult because you can be shot from this angle. But also, if your opponent's main thrust of their force, which is likely to be in the center of the board, they can also then attack you from this angle as well. So it's kind of what I talked about earlier about, if you're able to be shot from 2 angles, it's just that bit harder to find cover. But also, if you are out of cover, you then have sort of twice as many spots and twice as many units that you can be attacked from. And your opponent really has an incentive to put a long-range threat to just sit at the back and shoot every turn, because they need to hold their objectives, so they've no incentive to move. So, you know, you might even see like clone marksmen, for instance, to be sat as far back as they can, aim, shoot every turn, say they got the mortar, and they could just plink, plink, plink with their suppressive weapons. And yeah, it's just that it's quite tricky to hold that objective. Whereas at least for this top right objective, again, unless your opponent goes really aggressive, you should hopefully be able to be shot from 1 angle. And given you're planning to hold the sort of bottom right of the board anyway, because that's where you're going to be holding your home objective, you then have a really nice way of just consistently attacking into that top right objective. Again, this is no simplification. It's very board dependent. It's very army dependent, but it is just worth thinking about the ways you can be attacked versus sort of where you're likely to be attacking from and where your kind of strength and base is going to be. Here's an example of, again, how I might see a game going. You basically want your big threats to be as close to the center of the board as they can, because they're going to need to threaten probably the central objectives. If you're living the dream, maybe they even push for that back right objective and just attack your opponent's weakened units that may be sitting back there. But again, you can see here I've put my fast units, so the speeder bike and the taunt, kind of on the extremities, so they can push and challenge for sort of either the top right objective in the case of the taunts, or the bottom left in the case of the speeder bikes. And again here, you only need to contest, you don't need to control. So if you have speeder bikes, something with burst of speed, geos, whatever, that can just go bang, 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 3 speed 3s, 3 speed 2s, whatever in the late game, and just jump onto an objective, unless you have loads of firepower or it's stupidly early in the turn, there's not a lot your opponent can do about it. And again, speeder bikes, yes, they're expensive, they like 75, 80 points, but if they score you 1 VP by contesting, they've done their job. And again, if it robs your opponent of actions to try to kill them, like I don't know, I see people get really hung up on like speeder bikes not doing that much damage. I'm like, it's a bonus if they do damage. If they score you a VP, what more do you want? Like, I don't know. And like, I think that's why swoops are so powerful. Or we're edging on a rant here. It's why swoops are so powerful because they get the bonus of being able to do a pretty decent attack while also achieving their objective of scoring, and they cost 75 points with strike and fade because you always take a strike and fade. Like, it's yes, they're weak, but as long as they go fairly late in the turn, which is when they should be going anyway, and you just chuck them behind LOS blocking, like we looked at the range they can move earlier, like this speeder bike could probably contest even the sort of central right objective here, never mind the back one. Like, they can just move so far. They fundamentally change the way you can play the game, and it's why I will continue to say that speeder bikes are extremely strong in the current game, even if you don't want loads of them. Final one we're going to look at before I get into a full rant is going to be shifting priorities. Again, very similar deployment to recover the research here, so I'll just very quickly spin through the ranges again. Got that sort of furthest right one, and then your sort of furthest left corner as well, and then adding in that central one as well, you can see the ranges you've got there. And again, for this one, you can see that in contrast to the previous one, which had recovered the research, sort of all the objectives were kind of, at least your home objectives were like along the line your opponent could attack into. These ones are all going to be inside. So in order to contest, you're going to have to actually be more aggressive, move into that central area. And unless you're purely planning to somehow just go for the flanks or something, or maybe really hold one side and then push through, you're going to need to take some risks and go into this central area. And again, if you think about where the home and kind of away objectives are, I would think about these furthest right ones as being your home ones and the furthest left ones as being your opponent ones. Just because, again, you're likely to be holding this bottom right as kind of your area of strength, just because it's sort of where you can hoard up your units and kind of not worry about being attacked from, as we showed in that sort of damage thing earlier. And then, even though these sort of two left ones are actually fairly close, and it might actually be worth chucking like 1 or 2 token units over there, your main thrust is going to be towards the centre and probably these 2 objectives on the right-hand side. Again, if you think where you can be attacked from, hopefully makes a bit of sense. You're always going to be attacked from 2 angles for these sort of 2 left-hand objectives, whereas hopefully for these furthest right objectives, you can only actually be hit from 1 angle, which makes it, again, that bit easier to sort of hold them. And while this isn't always the case, because your opponent might move a bit more defensively, in general, you will have an area of strength on these 2 right-hand objectives, and realistically, probably an area of weakness on the 2 left-hand objectives. How I would typically see these sort of games playing out, it's pretty similar to Recover the Research, I'm not going to lie. There are a few nuances, but in general, leave your fast units on the flanks to be able to threaten objectives. You do need to be able to control these. It's not just about contesting. So it's not just enough to have one, but if you can have, 2 sweeps, 2 speeder bikes or something, it forces your opponent to kind of commit more resources to stop you doing that. And if they don't commit any resources on the flank, then you've basically guaranteed you're probably scoring like 2 or 3 VPs through the game just because you can repeat control. And yes, it then drags one of your units kind of out of the battle. But if a swoop bike or, I don't know, some rebel troopers or whatever can score you 2 or 3 points, absolutely fine. You are 100% okay with that. And then, as ever, you want your big threats probably just on your side of the board. So kind of for the red player to the left-hand side of the center, and for the Empire player to the left-hand side of the center, so that's the red player. Then for the rebel player, you probably have them just to the right, that's the blue player to this of the center, just so they can hold those. If I had, here I've put Sleeper Cell. If you have something that can jump out from behind LOS blocking and really do some damage, it might just be worth kind of floating that towards the left-hand side, just because it might force your opponent to commit an extra unit to contesting or controlling that objective. And then it just, again, takes 1 unit away from where you might be able to grab control of this right-hand side of the board. And a lot of it will sort of hinge on this central objective and who can control that, because often it'll be a kind of balance of the 2 sides and then who can grab that central objective. So it is kind of about controlling the middle of the board again, and there is a real sort of consistent theme, I'd say, through pretty much all of the objectives where you get big incentives for controlling the center, whether it's literally in the case of shifting or close the pocket, or tactically in terms of like a recover the research or bunker assault, for instance. But yeah, I have yacked on for far too long. Goodness, 47 minutes. that will probably do, I think, for now. I might let me know if there's anything else, any other aspects of the game would be interesting to talk about, kind of thinking about late game or even like how you're picking command cards or whatever. Like, this is just my attempt to kind of talk about what I think about in the early game and how I then go about sort of contesting and controlling those objectives into the late game. I really don't think there's much point going into like super nitty gritty details just because there's too many variables to actually work out what you're going to do in each scenario. But there are certain things and certain ways you can set yourself up for success in the early game. Another thing to note, the channel is now 1 year old. Can't quite believe it, but here we are. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who's liked, subscribed, commented, whatever. The channel's been going really well, really happy with it, and really pleased that people continue to watch and things like that. Got no idea where the channel will continue to go after this. I'm excited to see, new releases of Legion and things like that. Whisper, I have been looking into Shatterpoint recently. I don't think that's going to be like the long-term direction of the channel, but I would quite like to have a look at Shatterpoint stuff, and crucially it might just be a little bit easier given the scale of Shatterpoint to make bat reps and things like that, whereas I really don't have the space to do a bat rep for Legion. But yeah, let me know your horror at the possibility of me trying some Shatterpoint in the comments below. Like, subscribe, etc., and I will see you for the next one.